The Atheist Debates Patreon project takes a look at morality, the seemingly unavoidable discussion. So one topic that comes up over and over again is morality. It doesn't matter what topic you start discussing, if you're having conversations with believers, eventually morality is likely to come up. I've done a number of big formal debates, some of them where morality was the designated topic and others where it wasn't. And in almost every single one of them, at some point, we ended up talking about morality. So what is this morality thing? Why do we care about it? Why is it the go-to argument for so many conversations with believers? Let's take a look. So the conversation about morality has been so muddled and confused by religious doctrine and language that sometimes we can't even agree what we're talking about. And sometimes the label gets in the way. There's confusion over whether we're talking about morals or ethics or secular morality. Where does morality come from? Why do we care about any of this? And generally, I think that what we're talking about is how we go about surviving and thriving in the world, with a recognition that we are going to share space with other people, that the actions that I take are going to have consequences for myself and for others, and this is true for other people as well. And we'd like to go through and analyze what is our best course of action. And even saying that, one of the first things that people will try to suggest is, well, who decides what's best? Well, really nobody. Nobody decides what's best. My view on this, and there are lots of different views about solutions to the moral questions, but my view is that reality is the ultimate arbiter of what's right or wrong. I mean, when we look at how we live in the world, we are physical beings in a physical universe that dictates what the consequences of our action is going to be, as far as we can tell. And that should be enough to evaluate, hey, this action helps me thrive. Does it hurt other people? This action helps all of us thrive. This action really diminishes our well-being. This action diminishes our ability to survive and thrive. It's reality that is, as far as I can tell, the ultimate arbiter of what is right and what is wrong. But we're a part of that. We are the being within this. We're the ones that are taking action. We're the ones that are evaluating those actions. And it's not just about evaluating actions and the consequences, because motivation and intent come into it as well. If I back over you with the car, was that moral or not? Well, it depends on a lot of things. Did I know you were there? If knowing you were there and backing over you with the car, does that make it immoral? What if it was an accident? What if I thought I had it in drive and I accidentally backed over you? There's something about the intent and our motivations that colors the action and the consequences of those actions. And that's what makes morality so complicated. The world is robust. Things change. We're living in a dynamic universe. And what we need to do is consider each situation independently to create generalized assessments of actions that we then use as a sort of litmus test for future actions, so that we can make better decisions. But we need to do it with the recognition that we cannot just assess one situation and assume that it's going to apply to every similar situation, because there's sometimes extenuating circumstances. Morality is a big, hairy, complex topic, and it confuses a lot of people, but it's also the source of a lot of fears. So while I look at reality as the ultimate arbiter of what's morally correct and what's morally incorrect, one of the most common questions is, where do you get your morals from? And I cite reality, but I'd like to ask theists, where do you get your morals from? This is the argument for morality that they try to propose, and it has a number of different forms. But the core of it is that somewhere out there, outside of reality, I don't even know what that means, there is some being that serves as the foundation for their morality. Why? Why is it that when we're talking about how our actions, how our motivations help to build a better world or detract from our world, why is it that some being or entity outside of all of this, who's not a part of this system, serves as the ultimate source for their morality? There's a number of questions that we can follow up with, and we'll get to those a little bit later. But there seems to be this idea that morality is something that's given to you or that is innately recognizable. I've given a number of examples over the years of how some of this is actually wrong. If you have two kids who are out to dinner and they're misbehaving and their parents take them home, and one of the kids there's told, you know, next time we go out, if you're good, you'll get a treat, and if you're bad, you'll get a spanking or you'll get some punishment. And the other kid is sat down and they explain that, hey, there are other people around you. How would you feel if you were one of those people and someone was behaving the way you were behaving? Wouldn't that be a disruption to your meal? Wouldn't that be annoying? Wouldn't that be something that you would rather not see happen? And we've given this one of the children a foundation based on empathy, based on the facts, based on what we would desire, what we suspect other people might desire. And you go back out to dinner the next time, both of those kids are going to behave. But which one is more moral? This is where the motivations and the understanding come into it as well. I think it should be clear to almost everybody that the one kid who's doing it for the reward and to avoid punishment is, while his actions are the same, his morality is inferior. His motivation is inferior. And it's inferior because once you remove the carrot and stick motivation, once the parents are not in the picture, which one of those kids is more likely to behave? Because they actually understand this. And that's not the only example that we can use. I'm someone, when I drive around in traffic, I try to think about the other people on the road. I try to be courteous, and that makes me perhaps hyper aware of people who are being discourteous, people who are being inconsiderate and don't care and think that they own the road and they're not aware of anyone else around them. How do we go about setting up the rules that we should follow when we're driving around? This is roughly analogous to some views of morality in that, well, you know, you should use turn signals because this lets people, you know, become aware of your intent, whether it's to change lanes or to turn. You should drive within the limits of the law as far as speed goes. And when we construct these rules, we're not actually constructing moral strictures. When we're talking about traffic and motor vehicles anyway, we're trying to create a set of rules that allow people to get from point A to point B safely, quickly, and efficiently. We're allowed to change those rules, to try new things. They're not set in stone. In the early 70s, as a part of the oil crisis, the United States set up a nationwide maximum speed limit of 55 miles per hour. It lasted for a couple of decades, actually, before it was repealed. It didn't actually save as much fuel as they expected it was going to. That was a consideration because there's more to driving than just getting from A to B. Your actions on the road have effects on the atmosphere, and on oil prices and the economy. It didn't save as much fuel as they thought it was going to, but they kept it even after the fuel crisis was over because there was this idea that it saved lives, that it made driving safer. And there's data that suggests that that may have been the case in some scenarios, and there's data that suggests that wasn't the case, that perhaps the decrease in road fatalities was due to improvements in motor vehicles, so that it wasn't necessarily the speed limit. And there's data that shows that in some cases where the speed limit is higher, deaths have dropped there. So we experimented, found out that this maybe isn't the best way, so we'll let the states decide what their speed limits are going to be, and we've kind of gone back to what we had. This is the advantage of a secular moral system as well. It has at its center the goal of getting better at getting better. And so it allows us to say, you know what, we've had these principles. We've started with some simple foundations, for example, that life is generally preferable to death, and health is preferable to sickness, and pleasure is preferable to pain. And we recognize that there are exceptions to those generalized rules, and that those rules come in conflict, that we're talking about this dynamic, robust world that we live in. And so there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all, but we can come up with basic rules that serve as guidelines to help us come up with better rules down the line. But if we can't agree on simple things like, hey, it's better if we didn't just allow people to run around killing each other, if we can't agree on something like that, then we're kind of stuck. And this is one of the many fears that prey upon religious individuals. Religions exploit this sort of fear. Oh my gosh, it's all just a matter of opinion. Anything goes. It's all subjective. It's cats and dogs. We're all going to die just because we may not all necessarily agree on something. Do they have a solution for that? So there's a number of different versions of the argument from morality. There's a formal version that is, if morality is objective and absolute, then there must be a God. Morality is objective and absolute, therefore there must be a God. Now, this version of the argument is the more formalized one. It doesn't tell you anything at all about who this God is, what this God wants. It just tries to make a case that because morality is objective and absolute, there must be a God. Well, there's two premises there. The first one, if morality is objective and absolute, there must be a God. Is that the case? Is it impossible? Have they demonstrated that it's impossible to have an objective and absolute morality without a God? I don't see that that's ever been done. In fact, when you get into those conversations and you try to talk about whether or not morality is objective or whether there are any absolutes, and I'm talking about absolutes even in the context of situations, that within this situation there's a finite set of actions one can take, and so some set of one or more actions must represent the moral pinnacle or the moral absolute for that situation. Whether you subscribe to that situational morality or not, that could be viewed as an absolute. It's not the same as the absolutes that religionists often use, which is that, oh, there's this one size fits all, this is absolutely wrong and always wrong, and there's no extenuating circumstances. So the first premise, if morality is absolute and objective, there must be a God, is something that nobody's ever demonstrated. And they don't try to. Instead, they'll shift the burden of proof, say, well, how do you get objective and absolute moral standards without a God? Well, just because I don't have an answer to that, and I think that I might, depending on definitions, doesn't mean that they're correct, that the only solution, or even the best solution, is to appeal to some God. The second premise of that argument is that morals are in fact objective and absolute. Well, have they established this? I'm not aware that they've established this, at least not in the context that they tend to be talking about, that there's some standard that's completely independent of us and our desires, that is absolute and not dependent upon situations or anything else like that. So this simplified formal version of the argument has two premises, and both of them are dubious at best. That's not much of an argument. And even if they weren't dubious, even if they were to be reasonable, reliable premises, it doesn't tell you anything at all about this God other than this is the source of morality. And if that's all you know about it, why call it God? Why not just say that there must be some external source for morality and we don't know what it is? So there are other versions of the argument for morality as well, the kind of informal versions. One of them is this idea that it doesn't actually demonstrate that a God exists. It tries to argue for the necessity of a God. And basically it's, if there is no God, then everything is subjective and it's all chaos and it's all up to whatever anybody wants to do. And oh my gosh, it's a catastrophe. And the argument basically boils down to, if there isn't a God, this isn't the type of world I want to live in. Well, the type of world you want to live in has no bearing on the type of world you actually do live in. This isn't an argument for the existence of God. It's an argument for, boy, oh boy, I really wish there was a God because I'm absolutely terrified of the consequences if there isn't one. So the third version of the argument for morality that I want to address is one where the basic claim is that we observe a moral order, some sort of uniformity of moral assessment that we all share, that we all have some innate sense of right and wrong. And that the best explanation for this shared sense of morality is that there is some external source, which is then God. Now, I don't know how they got to the idea that this is in fact the best explanation. I've talked about what are the odds before, trying to determine that there must be some sort of supernatural source or supernatural foundation for these things. I don't see any justification for it. I don't even know how you could begin to calculate or assess that. But what's worse is that their claim simply isn't true. Take a look at children. Children are taught right from wrong. They don't come prepackaged with a clear understanding of right and wrong. They develop this. They are taught, and hopefully they are taught well, so that they exercise some empathy. They consider the consequences of their action. They think about what they would like to happen to them, and they also put themselves in the place of the other person to see what would happen, how they would feel if they were that other person. And then from there we can move forward to actually talking to that other person to find out what they would like to have happen. This is where the ethics of reciprocity and the golden rule come into play. And I don't have a huge problem with the golden rule. I think in some versions it's pretty decent. The version that Jesus came forward with, though, is actually not my favorite. It's not even close to my favorite, because that version is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, that's an incredibly self-centered view of the world. It not only puts you in the position of being the ultimate moral arbiter, They will play it off as if God has given them this instruction. But the truth is that it puts you in the position of, I'm going to determine what's right, and I'm going to impose this on others as well. Doing unto others as you would have done to you. Well, what if they don't want to be treated that way? What if they have different views? What if, you prefer blunt honesty and they prefer maybe some sugarcoating? Trying to treat people in the way that you would want to be treated is not necessarily best. Better versions of that ethic of reciprocity include things like do unto others as they would have you do unto them, with some limitations, because if somebody wants you to kill them, that may not necessarily be the most morally correct action. There's not a simple solution, and we shouldn't be trying to take these questions and make everything one size fits all. We have to recognize that the world is more complicated than that. And another thing that demonstrates that they're actually wrong about this shared intuitive understanding of morality is that views about morality have changed over the years. We no longer think that the same things are moral that used to be. They also vary between cultures, and they vary between time periods within different religions. It's why we end up with so many different denominations. They disagree on doctrine, they disagree on morality, they disagree on pretty much anything. Our views about what is and isn't right or wrong have changed. Now, why have they changed? Is it because the universe has changed? Well, perhaps somewhat, but I think my explanation is that they've changed because we have gotten better at understanding these things. We are building upon the thoughts of others. We are building upon the historic understanding of right and wrong, learning more about the consequences of actions, seeing further than we have before, and reevaluating what our positions are. What's the religious explanation for why things have changed? Are we becoming more in tune with God or less in tune with God? You'll hear that from both of them. Oh, the world's going to hell in a handbasket because we've fallen away from God. And yet, when you actually look at the state that the world's in, so far as I can tell, we live in pretty much the best time there ever has been in almost any measure. So I've mentioned a couple times in this video about fear, about how religion may be playing upon and exploiting the fears of believers. It may also be creating those fears. It's been said before that religion poisons you and then offers you the cure. And I prefer to say that religion convinces you that you're poisoned when you're actually not, and then offers you their homeopathic remedy. Either way, some of the fears that people have about morality and about how can we have a world if there's not a God and everything's just, oh, it's too scary, they're not real fears. They're not things that we find in reality. They're preventing us from having the sort of conversations that we're going to need to have. The world's going to become more complex. We're going to need to have more conversations about identity and bigger issues. And if we can't get together on some of the basics, that's going to make it difficult. And this is an objection that religions launch at secular moral systems. So what kind of objections do they launch? And how much merit is there? What is it that they're actually objecting to? And do they have a solution? So probably the most common objection that's launched at secular moral systems is something along the lines of, well, you say that this is moral and somebody else says that this is immoral. How do you resolve that conflict? You've got nothing to point to. Well, how do theists resolve that conflict? It's exactly the same. They're saying that something is immoral and people don't agree with them. And so they would try to point to their standard being their holy book or their deity or their personal interpretation of their holy book or what their deity wants. Their objection seems to be that we don't have an objective standard to point to, and neither do they. The truth is, all they can point to is their assessment, their opinion, or their book to say this is what it says or this is what I think it says. And ultimately, someone's either going to agree with them or they're not. They are stuck in exactly the same dilemma that they are objecting to. Their objection doesn't hold any water. And this is true for nearly every single objection that theists ever raised about the subject of morality. And part of the reason for this is that we haven't solved this issue of morality, and we may never. It's a process. We live in a world that's changing. There's too much information for us to even assess. To pretend that there's some simple solution that comes from on high may actually muddy the waters to the point that the entirety of the subject is more confusing and more complex than it was in the first place. perhaps we could begin with simpler beginnings and build. I'd argue that that's exactly what we've done throughout history, that it's almost intuitive to recognize that, hey, I'd kind of like to keep on living. I like this, it's kind of fun, it's beautiful out. I'd rather be experiencing this than, not. I'd rather be alive than dead. And that there are probably other people who feel the same way. In fact, we are the offspring of generations of people who have pretty much felt the same way. And that if this is the case, then it's in my best interest to encourage a society where people aren't considered moral for slaughtering me, and where I'm not considered moral for slaughtering them. These simple ideas that get to the heart of who we are in the world that we inhabit are the foundations upon which we build things. The problem is, thinking about moral issues, assessing the moral dilemmas that we're going to come across, is difficult. It's hard work, and we're lazy. We would much rather have an answer spoon-fed to us, but it's not a satisfying answer, and it's not an answer that increases our understanding of reality or improves our understanding of morality if we just say, oh, because I said so, or because God said so, or because this book says so. If instead it's because these are the facts about reality, because these are the facts about who we are, you have a much more robust method for assessing moral dilemmas. So what is the takeaway from all of this? Whether or not the truth about morality is that it has some objective source, whether it's God or reality, or whether it's ultimately subjective, the arguments that theists present surrounding the issue of morality don't do anything to demonstrate that a God exists. They don't do anything to demonstrate a resolution to this problem of objective versus subjective morality. Every objection that they launch pretty much is one that they can't solve either. And we're all in this boat together. We all have things to investigate and to learn. And to pretend that we have the answers already, or that the answers have been delivered from on high, is a huge mistake. One of the first debates that I ever did, a big public formal debate, was against an Orthodox priest named Father Hans Jacobsing. And the subject was the source of human morality. Throughout the debate, he agreed with me. You can come to correct moral assessments using purely secular means. Essentially agreeing with my position across the board until his closing remarks. And then he pulled one of the most amazing Jekyll and Hyde routines I've ever seen, where he got up and said that secular morality essentially necessarily leads to gulags and eugenics and all sorts of stuff that's just bad. It's fear-mongering. It's the sort of fear-mongering that I've talked about a little bit throughout the course of this video. Psalm 14:1 says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They can do no good works. There is none who does good." Some version of that has been bandied around, and people tend to remember, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. I'm not calling you a fool. The Bible is. Ha 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 ha, you atheists. The second part of the verse gets ignored because it's so obviously wrong. It's claiming that those who don't believe in God can't do anything good, and yet here we are doing good all the time. Here we are with our secular charities, our humanistic efforts, our attempts to oppose a lot of the harm done by religions in the name of religion. It's gotten to the point where even in a debate, my opponents have agreed, well, of course you can be moral as an atheist. It's very rare nowadays to hear someone say, you atheists cannot be moral. It's very few that would be in agreement with Psalm 14:1, but it's rare to actually hear that. It's become so clear that we can do it that they just kind of dismiss it. And instead they'll move on to perhaps a passage from Romans saying that the reason that we can be good is because God has written his moral code in our heart. God is the reason why we can do good. We're borrowing from their worldview. And there's a number of different theistic worldviews about morality. There's the divine command theory, that something is moral because God says so, because God dictates it. That way, if God decides to change his mind about what's moral, that can happen too. Another version, which we heard from Cy during my debate with him, was that it's about God's character, and that it's not wrong to steal because God says so. It's wrong to steal because God isn't a thief. But this portrays this idea that we should be trying to be like God. That's kind of at the heart of a lot of religious views, particularly within Christianity. Be like God. Well, what would the world be like if there were 7 billion megalomaniacal thugs demanding worship, killing people, and and ordering people to be killed for picking up sticks or being drunk or being disrespectful to their parents, etc.? And the question that I like to ask Christians in particular is, how did you determine that God is the good one? Or that there is a good one? But for those who believe that God is good and the devil is evil, how did you come to that conclusion? What standard did you use to assess? Now, no matter what their answer is, unless they say, I haven't done the assessment, they're acknowledging that they are using their standard and making an assessment on their own. They're thinking about the issue in the same way that any of the rest of us would. What they'll often appeal to is this idea that they're judging God by the standard that he's written on his heart, on their hearts. But anybody would come out smelling like roses if they're judged against their own standard. If Satan wrote his standard on your heart and you judged him, you'd think he was morally perfect as well. There's no solution to that. This is the core, in some ways, of the Euthyphro dilemma. And while the Euthyphro dilemma was originally an assessment of piety, whether or not something is pious, it works just as well for morality. And that is something moral because God says so, or you could say because it's God's character, or does God say so because it's moral? If the former is true, if something's moral just because God says so, then now we're in the realm of capriciousness, that divine fiat, and whatever God says goes. So if God decides to say tomorrow that, killing and torturing people is morally correct, then that is so. And that leaves morality without any meaning. It is as devoid of meaning as anything theists would suggest on our part. But if the alternate is true, that something, that God says something because it is in fact moral, then that puts us in another position entirely. That means that there is some foundation for moral truths out there that can be discovered, and God becomes irrelevant to that. I didn't need a commandment to tell me that killing people was wrong. I just needed a little bit of empathy and a little bit of understanding of the consequences of my action and the fact that I'm sharing space with other people. Our ancestors did pretty much the same thing, but they codified some of it to keep people in line, to give people easy answers, to say this is the way things are going to be. And that trained us to not only rely on authorities, but to not do a very good job of thinking and evaluating these situations when we come across them. There's no easy answers to the complex questions that we see in various moral dilemmas. But we don't have to make it harder by pretending that we've found a simple answer when we absolutely have not.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.